to this last webinar of the year. This is the end of all the efforts of approximately 3 years, and it's going to be the webinar with which we're going to close 2024. So again, welcome to this webinar on African swine fever. And today we have excellent panel members. I am Erika Calderon. I am going to be the moderator along with Dr. Campuzano. Today I work for IICA. We both work for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, IICA, and this is an initiative interagencies, and all these webinars are under the structure of ISDAC, and we work with the different agencies in the development of all these webinars with WOA, FAO, CARIBET, LACAM, CBP, USDA, OIRSA, and COPEC under ICA's coordination. And today, we're going to have excellent panel members. We have Dr. Andrew Rostovny. In general, with the foundations and role played by wildlife in the transmission of African swine fever. We will also have Dr. Masilius with the European experience on the transmission of African swine fever in wildlife. We will also have Luis Recona on all the surveillance conducted in Mexico with the feral pigs. And we will also have the participation of Dr. Vienna Brown talking about African swine fever surveillance and response planning in the U.S. feral swine. And as you can see, we have excellent speakers with a great experience. And I would like to remind you that this webinar is being broadcasted on IICA's social media. Both it's being transmitted in Portuguese, French, English, and Spanish. I would also like to encourage you to send your questions, because all the questions are done through the chat, be it the conventional chat or the one for Q&A that we have both in Zoom and social media. And I would also like to invite you to introduce yourself, tell us the country and institution you represent. It's important for all of us to know who our participants are. And we will soon be sharing with you a survey that is aimed at the impact that these webinars have had throughout the 3 years in your country. So it's really important for us to complete this survey and send it back to us. For the institutions that work on these efforts, it's really important to know that these webinars have caused a change in all of you. So without further ado, we will start with the first presentation from Dr. Rostalny. And I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Is a veterinarian with 20 years of experience in international livestock health, and for the past 19 years, he has been working for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, both at Rome's headquarters and in the field. He joined the FAO at its sub-regional office for Central and Eastern Europe in Hungary in 2005. Dr. Rostalny contributed to the development and implementation of FAO animal health and livestock development programs in Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia countries. Among other tasks, he has been provided technical assistance and capacity development of veterinary services for risk management of high-impact cross-border animal diseases of high impact, such as foot and mouth disease, the high pathogenic avian influenza, African swine fever, lumpy skin diseases, and others. Since the emergence of African swine fever genotype 2 in Georgia back in 2007, he has been part of a team that leads the FAO's assistance in ASF control in Eastern Europe. Since 2018, Dr. Rolstalny joined the Emergency Prevention System for Animal Health, Empress AH, at the FAO headquarters in Rome, Italy, to develop policies and strategies for prevention and control of priority high-impact animal diseases and provides assistance in the delivery of the Empress program. He leads the FAO works on ASF prevention and control, including GFTAD's global initiative on ASF for the control of African swine fever, and he is the chair of the working group on GFTAD, jointly with the colleagues from WOA. Since November 2024, Dr. Rostelny got assigned as an interim manager for the FAO Emergency Management Center. He has authored numerous technical resources like disease situation updates, risk assessments, and guidelines. He has been actively involved in the research, contributing to numerous scientific publications. So, with all his experience, I leave you with Dr. Rostalny for him to share his screen and start with the presentation. Thank you. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Erika. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very good.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thank you for introduction. And today I have pleasure to provide you some ideas, some experience on role of wild pigs, including feral pigs, in spread of African swine fever. And we will discuss on options for management of ASF, as it's quite a challenging task. So as I was introduced, I am veterinarian, animal health officer at FAO headquarters in Rome. And today we will talk about the role of wild boars and feral pigs in ISF spread. I will provide you with the current situation. And also we will discuss surveillance and management options. Some of our work on development of geographical information system, GIS, for decision support. And then, as usual, we recommend some of our publications and resources on this subject, on this topic. So at the beginning, let me just remind you about the global situation with African swine fever. There is two maps. On your left side, there is outbreaks both in wild and domestic pigs, and on right side, it's only outbreaks in wild pigs, marked in green color. As you can see, African swine fever spread globally, and it's endemic in many countries of sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, South Europe, and also South Asia and Southeast Asia. And luckily, America is free, with exception of Hispaniola Island. But if African swine fever introduced to your region, to Americas, then low biosecurity pig production sector is likely to become a reservoir for African swine fever, following the same epidemiological cycle as it's happened in other regions, for example, in Europe or Asia. However, despite of presence of backyard pigs, pigs kept in low biosecurity settings, both European wild boar and feral pigs are present in part of the continent, and they shown on these two maps. And in principle, as we all know, there's three epidemiological situation related to African swine fever and wild pigs. It's presence of African swine fever in backyard pigs, with occasional spillover to wild feral pigs, as it's observed in West Africa, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and other regions. Or African swine fever will be in wild and feral pigs, with occasional spillover to domestic pigs, as it's observed in Western Europe and North Korea. And there is ping pong model when epidemiological reservoir could be both either backyard or wild feral pigs, and changes from place to place and spillover in both directions. This slide, I would just provide you ideas about the mapping of backyard pigs and wild pigs, and detection of the interface, where basically this ping pong model is very, very likely. Spillover from backyard sector to wild pigs and back. A little bit about the cycle related to wild boar habitat. It's self-sustained transmission due to virus survival in carcasses and reinfection of healthy pigs months after the death. And the cycle is maintained in large and sufficiently dense and continuously distributed populations of wild pigs. The disease can be self-limiting, for example, cause local extinction of all pigs, but it's only theoretically. Practically, this is not happening simultaneously all over the affected country. And therefore, eradication and even reasonably effective control are nearly impossible or extremely difficult if ISAF develops into epidemic and expands over large areas of suitable landscapes, as it's happened in Europe. So with regards to the involvement of wild boar, biosecurity is important. And as we know, there are several ways of transmission of virus, and one of them is disposal of contaminated carcasses, and then products scavenged by wild boar. And it's very common when carcasses of dead domestic pigs dumped somewhere, and then wild boar have access to these carcasses contaminated with virus. It could be direct contact between domestic and wild pigs, where a free-range pig breeding system exists. This is quite rare and limited to season and localized. There's also environmental contamination and mechanical transmission with feed of livestock species sharing habitats with wildlife, or humans attending wild boar habitats, like hunters or berry pickers or foresters. It's moderately common, but also quite common in Europe. And also it's hunting of wild boar and the delivery of contaminated carcasses to the households. There are also a lot of cases recorded that it's happened, in particular in European region. So just to remind you about 4 distinct epidemiological phases, it's incursion, and this incursion in most of the cases missed, and ISAF detection is delayed by months. And often invasion or even the peak of epidemic are considered as incursion. And basically this affects very much our chance to effectively detect, contain, and control disease. And endemicity may revert to epidemic, provided that host population recovered. So this slide also shows you the dynamic and outcomes of incursion. It could be a situation when there is no spread with limited number of wild boar, and it could be effective spread from incursion to invasion. This slide also shows the probability of detecting of ASF through different approaches, through passive and active surveillance during the initial spread of the virus. And most effective is searching for the carcasses of dead wild pigs. It's orders of magnitude more sensitive compared to testing of short hunted animals. And probability of carcass finding is highly seasonal depending on when ASF was introduced and can be more or less likely detected. On average in Europe, 1 to 10 carcasses is discovered, but this also will be highly variable depending on the phase of infection, season, and population density. By saying that, also we should not exclude other situations with emergence of recombinant African swine fever virus due to use of illicit vaccine in Southeast Asia, when the chance that we can detect case through passive surveillance might be threatened or compromised because African swine fever might have another, clinical signs and be more chronic. In that case, active surveillance will have more chance for early detection. A little bit on early management of incursions, and basically the management of African swine fever in wild boar will be effective only if it's done early. And basically, this slide is coming from the some of publications developed jointly by FAO, WHO, and European Commission. And it shows detection of ASF positive cases in 1 to 2 weeks, and creation of convex hull around all carcasses detection, buffered with around 6 kilometers. And of course, this area is area of intensively search for carcasses. And the buffering procedure is repeated at a regular interval. And of course, this zone usually increasing with detection of new carcasses and expansion geographically. And that's done on a continuous basis until the zone is basically settled and we know, we're confident of our infected and surveillance zone. And for the management, there is zoning around African swine fever incursion and management intervention. Basically in invasion zone, we conduct passive surveillance and carcass removal. And basically this passive surveillance conducted in all zones. Active surveillance only outside this infected area, and the intensive carcass removal in infected area, and stopping hunting and supplementing feeding in the infected area. In zone 2, hunting with caution, and in other areas 3 and around, there is hunting as usual or even intensive hunting to reduce density. So all this based on experience in Europe and basically well published and applied in many countries. Now I would like to talk a little bit on the role of importance of cooperation of veterinarians with zoologists, with wildlife experts, especially dealing with mapping of wild pigs and doing the modeling of distribution. And here I would like to draw attention to publication which came to my attention on wild pigs and their widespread threat to biodiversity conservation in South America, where there is highlight that wild boar produce negative impact and ecological niche modeling used to predict potential wild boar distribution, and it's provide information that most ecoregions in South America have suitable condition to sustain wild boar population. alarming large number of wild pigs in protected areas. And all this very important for planning of surveillance and control, because there is a very suitable ecological niche for the endemic ISF in wild pigs. So in this article, there's very interesting information on the mapping, on the biodiversity and the different model. A binary model which show just absence or presence of wild pigs, and also continuous model where suitability modeled considering many other additional factors for presence or absence of wild pigs or feral pigs in the region. So you can see that all area in Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil are quite suitable for the wild pigs. So now a little bit on work which FAO done on geographical information system on mapping of density, location of wild boars and also domestic pigs. And it's very important where this risk spots or weak spots, where there is a large number of backyard population of domestic pigs and wild boars, and it's very important to know before the incursion happen. And also to understand the epidemiological context and build a reasonable hypothesis for potential introduction, incursion, and expansion of African swine fever virus, and then anticipate the implication for disease control. So this slide shows you some of disease ISF mapping in various populations. So it's also important to do it to study suitability of African swine fever persistence, also considering climatic factors such as temperature, but also wild boar densities and habitat transformation. So this is a time to do this analysis. We have a multi factor for the prepared risk assessments. Based on more than basically 15 years work on application of GIS for African swine fever, we developed the guideline for decision support, which include data collection, data cleaning and processing, creating GIS warehouse, setting up protocols to keep information up to date, and providing the access to users. And at the end, I would like to draw attention to some of FAO publications, some of them developed in cooperation with World Organization for Animal Health, OE, and European Commission. It's the second edition of African swine fever in wild boar ecology and biosecurity, template for control and eradication plan for the African swine fever. And both these two publications actually developed with support of expert who will present after me, Dr. Masirius, and also the publication which I just mentioned, which in the process of publication, and it will be released in January on application of geographical information system for ISF surveillance and control and management. So this is the outline of the future publication. It provides information about introduction of GIS method and how GIS can help with African swine fever management. It covers population mapping, starting with data collection units and spatial resolutions, describing pig population distribution, doing pig farm surveys and registers, mapping pigs in non-professional holdings, mapping wild and feral pigs population, gridded population maps, disaggregation and modeling, human population data, additional attributes of epidemiological units, principles of aggregation, and also a chapter on disease occurrence mapping, like disease event types and their notification, mapping ISF disease events in domestic pigs, mapping ISF cases in wild boar, and visualization of disease events in domestic and wild pigs. Also mapping risk of African swine fever spread. This is what we are doing for already 15 years. Risk factors at different stages, spatial risk factors, proximity and accessibility, movement data of live pigs and also pork and subproducts, epidemiological interfaces, and spatial risk factors and models. Based on this publication, we also plan to have a series of virtual learning center training courses, where you would be able to learn more on application of the Gs for African swine fever. Thank you for your attention.
Gracias por su atención.
We'll be happy to answer your questions.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Rostalny.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rostanley, and excellent presentation. We'll leave the question for the end. You can you stay around for some time, Dr. Rostanley? No problem?
Yes, yes.
Entonces, muchísimas gracias.
Perfect, so thank you very much. And we will now go on to the presentation of Dr. Masilius, and we'll give a brief bio regarding Dr. Marios. He is a veterinarian with over 16 years experience, including serving as head of the Emergency Response Division in Lithuania State Food and Veterinary Service. He specializes in infectious animal diseases such as African swine fever, classical swine fever, and avian influenza. Since African swine fever was first detected in Lithuania in 2014, Dr. Masilius has played a key role in drafting legislation, in developing veterinary programs, and coordinating outbreak responses, and leading operations involving wild boars and domestic pigs. His research includes wild boar trapping, movement studies, carcass disposal, and African swine fever virus survivability. He is currently an associate professor at the Lithuanian University of Health Sciences and an animal health specialist with the FAO. So with this introduction, Dr. Marias, please share your screen and you can begin your presentation.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So it is always a pleasure to be a part of this series of the webinar and to have the possibility to share some insights and to share some experience as regards the management and the control of African swine fever in wild boar population in the European Union and in the Europe in general. So today I will try to present you quite briefly what has been done in relation to the control of African swine fever in the wild boar population. And as you might see from the pictures, so that's the wild boars. Actually, so they have conquered a large territory in the Europe, and there are almost no single country except of Denmark where we can find the presence of the wild boars. So during the past statistical calculations, it has been estimated that the population has exceeded over 7 billion of the wild boars in Europe in total. So actually that's a very large number. And the wild boar started to be very important when African swine fever has entered the European Union, and it happens in January 2014. So actually what we see, African swine fever in wild boar cannot be managed directly. So there is no treatment and no vaccine available. The mortality is up to 90-95%, and that's the complex of epidemiological factors and the different transmission pathways involved in a sustaining endemicity and geographical expansion of African swine fever in Europe. What we can see in Europe, so actually there are some countries where only wild boars playing the major role in the sustaining African swine fever virus. In some of the countries, we might find the mixture. So there are two cycles. So the one where mainly involved wild boars, and the other one which mainly happens during the seasonal behavior of the humans. So that's the domestic pig cycle. And we have both cycles involved, which again in domestic pigs, that's mainly occurs during the seasons. So dealing with the current genotype 2, so we see the contagious form through the oral infection, and the virus is usually transmitted only through the direct transmission. So as I tried to explain, we have the wild Suides habitat cycle and the pure domestic pig cycle. But in both, again, the direct transmission is involved, and the virus is transmitted only through the direct contact. So on the left-hand side, you can see the situation at the European Union, and then on the right-hand side, so the situation of African swine fever globally. Again, so there are the different colors of the map. So later on, I will try to explain the meaning of the different zones. But actually, the disease entered in 2014. My country, actually, that was the first cases detected in wild boar population of African swine fever in the eastern part of the European Union. So then following the Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, so all the Eastern European part has been affected. And it took already over 10 years when we are facing the problems with African swine fever. And the virus has been stabilized mainly in the wild boar population with the seasonal jumps, mainly during the summertime in the domestic pig holdings. Except of some countries, as Romania, for example, where we mainly observe the domestic pig cycle. So what are the tools available for the control of animal diseases, including African swine fever in the European Union? So first of all, so that's the legislation, which is fully harmonized across all the 27 member states. So that's on the first, as the background, so that's the animal health law and the official controls regulation. Then we have the specific rules in the different forms of the delegated or implementing acts, or the specific rules for African swine fever, classical swine fever, lumpy skin disease in the form of regulation, which are obligatory to all and every member states belonging to the European Union. It is the very clear regionalization or zoning policy. Again, so the countries are regionalized based on the level of the estimated risk and, of course, the epidemiological findings. In each country, it should be contingency plans prepared and tested, of course, reference a laboratory network. It is financial support in the form of the co-financed eradication programs. And of course, all the countries are enforced to revise the legislation in place by the different audits. Trainings, awareness campaigns, international cooperation with the WOHA, with the FAO, through the GFTATS initiative and the bilateral cooperation with the training partners play a crucial roles. And as we know that many countries are trying to establish the stable and safe and efficient vaccine for African swine fever. So the EU as well spends a lot of money for the different research projects trying to investigate and to develop the vaccine against African swine fever. However, we still not have any commercially available vaccine on the market. So what are the main principles for the African swine fever zoning? So, of course, those zones are internationally recognized. So they are fully or partly recognized by certain trading partners. Since 2014, it has been proven to be effective to prevent or to control or even to slow down the spread of African swine fever or to help to eradicate African swine fever in the certain situation. So within the last 10 years, living with African swine fever, we have 3 stories of success when 3 countries have managed to eradicate African swine fever in wild boar population. Firstly, that was the Czech Republic. Later, that was the Belgium, and the last, which we just a few months ago have officially declared the free status for African swine fever in the wild boar population. So that was Sweden. Those countries has achieved this success, of course, with the enormous financial support by the local governments, by the clear legislation, and putting a lot of human and financial resources into the combat with African swine fever. But I should point out that actually the area infected was very limited, which actually act as a success to eradication. In areas affected by African swine fever, the zoning leads to the risk mitigation measures and helps different operators to continue the business. So those are the 3 colors, and actually we have the 3 different restricted zones. Restricted zone 1, which is in blue color. So actually that's the part of the country which are subject to the special disease control measures, which borders to restricted zones, affected or infected restricted zones. But in this restricted zone 1, so there are no African swine fever outbreaks detected. The pink one, so that's the restricted zone 2, where African swine fever has been detected in the wild boar population, and the restricted zone 3, the red one, where African swine fever has been detected in domestic pigs and as well might be in a wild boar population. So this legislation as regards the regionalization or zoning has fully aligned to the World Organization of Animal Health standards. So it again, the purpose is the same with the same principles, and the zoning applies to an animal subpopulation defined primarily on the geographical basis. So those member states or member countries may have 1 or even more such as zones depending on the epidemiological situation. You can always check and look on the special control measures, what is the legislation applicable in all the 27 member states belonging to the European Union. As well, you can always check the map summarizing the zoning measures, or through the interactive tool for African swine fever zoning measures. It is possible to check which territory belong to which restricted area. So looking very globally at all the countries' context and understanding that it is impossible to precisely know the size of the population of the wild boar, and there are different methodologies on how to estimate the size of the population, and seeing that actually the wild boars in most of the countries act as the true source of African swine fever virus. So the European Commission has forced the member states which are concerned, so actually all the European Union member states are concerned, so they are forced to establish a national action plans for wild boars in order to avoid the spread of African swine fever in the Union. So what does it mean? That each country should prepare its own national action plan on the wild boar management in order to decrease or try to decrease or stabilize the wild boar population, trying to slow down or avoid the presence of African swine fever. So that's actually, I will get the slide back. So that's our life before African swine fever and with. So you see, you very clearly see the difference. Before African swine fever, we had a lot of wild boars. So our hunting bag was almost 50,000 wild boars on the territory with 64,000 square kilometers. So with African swine fever, we have a constant positive cases, and we're dealing with numbers of the dead animals, trying to find them and safely dispose of, trying to slow down the spread of African swine fever. So within the first 4 years, when African swine fever started to spread through the eastern part of the European Union, through the European Food Safety Authority, it has been detected, or through the reports, it has been estimated that actually the virus in the EU was found more than 100 times beyond the radius of possible spread by the nearest infected wild boar. So actually this has been clearly indicated that short to medium virus jams are attributed to human activity. And that's really true, because the humans are the main cause of long distance transmission and virus introduction, not only into the pig farms, but as well to other hunting grounds. And this is crucial to include the social science when planning prevention, control, and eradication measures. If we would consider only the biological particularities of the disease, mainly looking into the contagiousness, tendency, case fatality, but if we will ignore the human aspects, so the epidemic will not be controlled. So you can see the circles with the areas infected. However, so they are far away from the nearest infected area, which again clearly demonstrate that it is not linked with the direct transmission from wild boar to wild boar, but the human again played the major role in those long or even short to medium jams. So we started to discuss a lot how or what we can do in order to prevent the drastic spread of the disease. And the biosecurity was the main tool which can be applicable and to reduce the risk of introduction and spread of the disease. Because for African swine fever, there are no treatment, there is no vaccine. So that's the only way to defend against the virus. So if we would apply the hunting biosecurity, I'm not touching the domestic pigs, so that's the biosecurity is very, very important, but as well during the hunting, we should not forget about the hunting biosecurity. So, and the overview, where to start. So that's the obligation for the countries. And what we did in the Europe, we started to develop the clear biosecurity rules for the hunters, for the hunting grounds. We started to change the behavior of the hunters and the hunting management in general. And each hunting ground should establish the different procedures on how to avoid dressing hunted wild boars on the site, how to ensure the secure transport of hunted wild boar to a designated dressing area. They should establish a dedicated fixed dressing area. It might be open air or it might be closed. So the procedures to clean and disinfect all the equipment used during the hunt or during the search of the dead wild boars. Properly dispose of offals or remains from the hunted wild boar, ensure the safe storage of hunted wild boar until testing, because each and every hunted wild boar in the high risk or infected areas need to be tested in order to be used for personal consumption or even placed on the local market. And as African swine fever virus kills its host, so how to safely dispose of found dead wild boars. So those procedures need to be applied not on the voluntary basis, but as the obligation, as the must for all who are in charge in the infected forest. So then again, additional procedure on the safe storage of hunted wild boars until testing, because there is always the question why we need to wait for the test result. But if the animal was infected, so the meat of the animal is also infected. So therefore, in the high risk or infected areas, the hunted wild boar should be sampled for laboratory testing. As the size of the infected areas actually enlarge through the natural movement of the wild boars or with the help of the humans, so it is impossible to manage properly such a large areas, and only through the hunting biosecurity it is possible to slow down the spread if the hunt is allowed. So only meat with African swine fever negative results, which has been tested by the polymerase chain reaction, can leave the hunting ground. So that should be the very clear rule and understandable and acceptable for all. Additional, hunters should process wild boars in the designated areas. They should store the leftovers, animal byproducts. Again, the different countries has been used different approaches. In some of the countries, so there are the sealed pits, underground pits, or containers with the further transportation to the rendering plant or incineration place within the hunting ground, because later on all those animal byproducts should be disposed of as per legislation. So how to detect African swine fever on the hunting ground? So actually, it's really different than for other animal diseases. The problem with African swine fever remains that African swine fever does not have any threshold which would be reached and the disease would fade out. So that's mean, so there are no such a number of the population which if we would minimize the wild boars, so the disease would disappear. Unfortunately, such a number does not exist. And we have three options to detect African swine fever on the hunting ground level, but not all of them are very useful or they might work 100%. So firstly, we're trying to detect wild boars behaving strangely. Again, so it's really depend from the size of the infected area and from the number of the people involved in the hunting activities or the forest managers, which could detect such a wild boars which behave strangely. But usually it's very rare to observe the sick wild boars. Another options would be to take the samples from the hunted wild boar, or the third option would be to go to find and to sample that wild boar. Okay, detecting African swine fever by clinical signs. Of course, the clinical signs are very similar or the same as for domestic pigs. So the color changes and hemorrhages in the skins are very easily missed because of the darker skin and thick hair of the wild boar. And of course, if the hunters or forest rangers seeing the wild boar which behave strangely, it should be shot and sampled. So we can call it sanitary shooting. However, the sick wild boar will hide and he will die. So that's really very unlikely that you would observe African swine fever infected animals. So having the experience over 10 years with African swine fever in my country, in the quite not very big territory with almost 64,000 square kilometer, testing on the yearly basis over 24,000 hunted wild boars. Just a few wild boars has been seen sick, and they have been shot and tested positive for African swine fever. So actually the probability to detect the sick wild boar is very, very rare, especially at the beginning. So then we can try to detect African swine fever by sampling each and every hunted wild boar. So samples can be taken, and the most important samples would be the blood, spleen, lymph nodes, and kidney. So actually, yes, the probability is much higher, but the number of the samples would increase, and we should always take into account the human resources, financial resources, and the other resources, including the laboratory resources for such an investigation, because the number of the animals to be sampled would be very, very high, and the probability to detect the first infected wild boar taking the samples from the hunted wild boar would be very, very low. So actually what works very well, so that's the sampling from the found dead wild boars. But for that, we need to go and to look for the dead animals. We try to search for them, to find them, and then to sample. If the carcass is fresh, so same samples can be taken as from the hunted wild boar. If the wild boar is or the carcass is decomposed, it's enough to take the long tubular bone, so the leg, and then from the bone marrow would be a very good sample using by the PCR for African swine fever virus detection. So the dead wild boar are the best way to find African swine fever, because the sick animals would hide and they would die. Some of the countries, they are trying to use the new technologies, and while searching the carcasses of the dead wild boars. So that's the example by the Germany, as the carcasses are searched using the drones equipped with the thermal cameras and the specially trained dogs. So again, as this involves many human resources, we should always do not forget about the principles of the biosecurity. So the biosecurity is very, very important in order not to act as the spreaders of African swine fever, because through the mechanical transmission, so the disease can be transmitted to the new areas. And again, this epidemiological cycle presented by Dr. Andrei would be repeated, and we will have again new incursion, new invasion, and new epidemiological wave in the new area, and our infected area would be constantly enlarged. So another approach, so the countries should be ready, and they should start to think how to safely dispose of the large numbers of the dead animals. So what would be the most preferred option as per legislation? Would it be possible to bury them on the spots where they are found, or would be possible to burn them, or again to store temporarily until they would be transported to the places of incineration or the rendering? So all those procedures should be already developed by the day of incursion. It's very easily to miss the very first infected wild boar, because African swine fever is described as the highly pathogenic disease. However, actually, the disease has the very high lethality. However, it spreads very, very slow and might remain undetected for weeks or even for months. Again, it would depend from the size of the population and from the direct contact with infected and sick animals or with the contaminated material. So sometimes the first detected case does not necessarily mean that we have really detected the very first case. And later on, when the disease started to develop, when the new wild-born metapopulations are getting infected, and we have the many wild boars to be dealt with, and we need to have the strategy how we'll safely dispose them of. So different countries have the different approach. In case of Lithuania, we bury them on the spot where they are found. So we have proven that actually by burying, the virus is destroyed, and further such a carcasses do not pose any further risk. At the beginning, we have tried to burn them. However, the burning is not the acceptable due to the environmental contamination, due to the pollution of the air. So this should be avoided. Most developed countries at the European Union context and the Europe in general, so they are using the rendering plants. But then again, the very clear procedures following the very clear biosecurity principles should be established from the infected area, how the carcasses would be collected, how they would be transposed to the places where they would be collected for the further rendering or incineration, because otherwise, so it would be very, very difficult to deal with the contaminated areas, and the virus would constantly spread further. So as regards the control strategy, of course, ongoing awareness campaigns, especially for the hunters, are essential because we need to inform them about the African swine fever strategy, what the strategy has been chosen by the country, about the hunting management. So they should be aware that actually at the beginning, after the detection of African swine fever, so actually their hunting management should be completely changed, and the life should not be anymore the same as it was before African swine fever. And it should be explained the objectives aimed at promoting their involvement in the strategy of controlling and eradicating of African swine fever in the wild boar population. So as you see, so many countries has been developed plenty of awareness materials trying to explain, engage, motivate the hunters, and involve them in the strategy, helping to deal with such a really devastating disease as African swine fever. So that was a very brief introduction as regards the African swine fever in the wild boar population at the European Union contest. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will be looking for the questions in the question and answer session.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Marius.
Thank you very much, Doctor. A great presentation. Alongside that from Dr. Rostelny, we can have a general overview of how can we approach this disease in Europe and how all this problem has been handled in the wild boars and feral pigs in Europe. So again, thank you very much. And just like Dr. Rostalny, I would like to invite you to stay with us because at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. We already have received some questions in the chat, but we are still waiting to gather more questions. So I would like to invite all participants to start sending your questions through the chat. Remember that this is a very exciting and good opportunity on the approach on surveillance of feral pigs in America, because all of these surveillance plans and all this approach that we have now is quite new. So the time has come to solve all these doubts. So again, thank you, Mario, and we'll continue with our next panel member. And Before introducing Dr. Brown, I would like to encourage you to send your questions to the chat. I would like to remind you that we are also on social media, both Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and others. So please, you can send your questions through our social media too. And at the same time, soon we're going to give you a link to the platform where we have all these webinars for the past 3 years. So I think that this is a valuable information that we can disseminate in our countries in order to aid in the preparation, eradication, and response to African swine fever. I would also like to tell you that we have Dr. Jorge Cañez, so greetings, doctor, from Senacica, Carla Duran from Peru, from Senasa, Peru, Maria del Carmen Merado from Mexico, from UNAM, Gillian Ellis from the Ministry of Agriculture in Jamaica, Roberto Guzman, greetings to you all and welcome from Colombia and Ecuador too. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Brown. She's an expert in the feral swine disease surveillance and SAF preparedness and response planning activities. She has worked with for the past 6 years with the Wildlife Services National Feral Swine Program. She has a PhD in microbiology and a master's in public health. So, Dr. Brown, the floor is yours for your presentation on African swine fever surveillance in the U.S.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Sí. Doctora, tiene que poner su presentación en modo...
Yes, we can hear you, but you need to switch to presentation mode, please.
In your screen display settings? Yes, that one. Duplicate.
Okay. All right. You can see my screen and hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Really, really appreciate it and really have enjoyed the presentations leading up to mine and appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I'm Deanna Brown. I just very recently changed jobs, but I spent many years working for Wildlife Services at the feral swine interface. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the work we've done in that space. So super briefly, just a real brief background on feral swine in the United States. Swine are non-native to North America. From a U.S. specific perspective, they were brought into the United States in the 1500s by explorers, and then there have been repeated introductions ever since. In the past, about 20 to 30 years, even closer to 40 years now, feral swine populations and the distribution has greatly expanded. A big driver of that is just because of anthropogenic movement. It is very well documented that humans will travel to areas where we have high densities of feral swine in the US, load up a truck or a trailer load of pigs, and then transport them to create local hunting opportunities. And on the next slide, you'll see we have these non-contiguous populations, which are very representative of that anthropogenic movement. Of course, there have also been escapees from fence farming and hunting operations. And then because domestic swine and feral swine are the same species, there has been interbreeding between these free-ranging domestic pigs and our extensive population of feral pigs. And so that population has really grown. At this time, we estimate between 6 and 9 million feral swine to be found across more than 35 states. So it's quite a problem. In terms of our feral swine populations, this is just a presence-absence map for the U.S. You'll notice that that California, Texas, Oklahoma, and then that whole southeast seaboard have really, really high densities of feral swine. This map is just a presence-absence map, but in terms of population size and swine density, that whole southeast is very, very dense populations. And as I mentioned, you can see counties that are shaded in this kind of central and northern US that, are far away from any other feral swine areas. And again, that is a driver of, or that is indicative of this anthropogenic movement. And so just to kind of pivot into our topic at hand, having provided a bit of background around feral swine within the US, we have been doing extensive ASF surveillance within the continental US as well as the Caribbean territories since the introduction of ASF within Hispaniola. And so, of course, this map doesn't surprise anyone. ASF is found in a lot of places in domestic pigs, in wild boar, and in some places in both. And so, as the virus is amplifying around the world, that makes all of us at greater risk. And so when the virus was first kind of made the big jump in 2019, 2018, I think it was late 2018, from Eastern Europe, and sort of kind of entered into Belgium and then kind of marched into Western, into Central and more Western Europe, and then jumped from into China and spread very quickly throughout Southeast Asia. We initiated a morbidity mortality surveillance. And so, as I mentioned, this was established in the spring of 2019, following those kind of big jumps into Western Europe and to Asia. In that time, we have found 33 either sick or dead feral swine on the landscape. You may notice, and you're totally right, that in nearly 6 years of looking, we have only found 33 feral swine that kind of hit the metric for this surveillance stream. And we know, based on CWD and other diseases and kind of wildlife or feral animals, it's hard to find animals on the landscape. And we just heard about that from our European partners. And so, when this happens, it's happened about nearly 36 times. We triage these through our veterinary services framework for an animal disease investigation. And so these, if one of our field biologists finds an animal that kind of trips the trigger for this surveillance system, they'll reach out through their wildlife services chain and then also work with their local veterinary services veterinarian, as well as their state animal health official, to kind of triage this up through that existing foreign animal disease framework. And so, as I mentioned, this is a super collaborative effort. We've had some really great, partnerships. This has encouraged and expanded the networking and the interpersonal relationships when we've had these cases on the landscape. The finding of African swine fever virus in the Western Hemisphere really kind of kicked off an even more expanded and active surveillance stream within the US and its territories starting as early as August 2021. So very soon after the detection on the island of Hispaniola, we expanded our feral swine surveillance in Puerto Rico. We needed some way to kind of prioritize the island in terms of where we wanted to work first. And so we worked with our partners in veterinary services, Centers for Epidemiology and Animal Health, to really kind of figure out what that risk profile looked like. And Puerto Rico is interesting in that there's kind of these two distinct types of feral swine, one of which is a byproduct of the pet trade. These are very urban, and they're largely Vietnamese potbelly descendants, and they are living in and amongst people. And so that's a really kind of interesting dynamic in and of itself. Kind of think pigeons in a city street. They're sleeping in people's gardens. They are nested and bedded down against apartment buildings. They are incredibly urban. And with that, they are rummaging in dumpsters. They are in and around the airport. They are in places that give us some consternation from an ASF introduction perspective. The other population of feral swine is what we think of as kind of true feral swine. These are, crepuscular and nocturnal critters. They are very human avoidant, and they are, much more similar to the types of animals that we're managing within the continental US. And so you'll notice that from this risk surveillance priority profile, our highest priority riskiest areas are those that overlap quite distinctly with the highest human populations. And again, this is because of those urban feral swine that are in and around humans. And so this is kind of how we've been working our way around the island with, pushing those feral swine populations, kind of both populations, to very low levels. Since August of 2021, we've had just extended campaigns for managing feral swine, both within Puerto Rico and within the U.S. Virgin Islands, although those populations are much, much smaller. We've taken just under 6,000 feral swine across the island of Puerto Rico, and we've sampled 3,500 of those animals. In terms of our sampling profile, we are sampling all pigs that hit the ground except for juveniles. So if we've got a sow with nursing piglets, we don't sample her piglets, but we sample all adult and subadult animals. And the rationale behind that is just that the piglets represent their mama from a maternal antibody perspective, so they don't really give us any new information. We then expanded into the continental US in terms of our surveillance. So the first iteration of continental US surveillance started in May of 2022 within Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And these are the 4 states that rose to the highest concern from a surveillance perspective, from a risk of introduction perspective, based on the ongoing outbreak in Hispaniola. So these 4 states are all in the southern US, on the Caribbean Gulf Coast. These 4 states do not represent the risk coming out of Asia, Africa, Europe. These are just counties with feral swine that are at very high risk from a risk of ASF introduction, specifically coming out of Hispaniola. So we have ongoing national surveillance activities, and so we are already providing low, medium, and high priority counties for classical swine fever, swine brucellosis, and pseudorabies, and then we just tacked on the risk of ASF introduction, which can be found in that kind of muddy brown-red color across those 4 states. So in counties, in the very high-risk counties in those 4 states, we expanded our surveillance to include ASF, both PCR and ELISA-based diagnostics across all adult and subadult animals. So exactly mirroring what we were doing in the Caribbean. We've done a couple iterations of expansions, and this is what our ASF map looks like. ASF surveillance map looks like in this moment in time. The original 4 states, Florida, Georgia, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas are of course these 4 states. And so we stood those up in May of 2022. And again, this is based solely on risk coming out of Hispaniola. In May of 23, we expanded into the yellow, the states with yellow counties. This is representative of risk, ASF risk of introduction from anywhere in the world. So this is global risk pathways. This captures risk coming out of Asia, captures risk coming out of Europe and Africa. And then we also included this robin's egg blue, which represents the whole of the US-Mexico border, as well as the Florida Gulf Coast. And this is just based on the risk from the border. We know that there is a lot of undocumented movement of humans and products in that area coming across from the Caribbean and up through Central America and Mexico. And so wanting to account for that kind of undocumented risk. This is where we stand right now in terms of our ASF risk pathways. We are doing surveillance in these 12 states, active surveillance in these 12 states. Specifically within these counties, we are looking for evidence of active infection via PCR, historical exposure via ELISA for all adult and subadult feral swine removed from these counties within these 12 states. At this moment in time, we've collected over 15,000 samples from within the continental US. And then in May of 2024, April of 2024, so just very recently, we expanded our national surveillance efforts to include ASF serology. And so, as I mentioned, we've had national surveillance ongoing for years in feral swine, where we've been looking at classical swine fever, swine brucellosis, and pseudorabies virus. This is all antibody, so historical exposure. And we just expanded our national surveillance activities to include ASF. So in any pigs that are dispatched from any counties outside of these highlighted counties, a subset of those are collected for national surveillance efforts. And that's what this cluster represents. And now all animals that are collected for normal national surveillance are also receiving ASF ELISA-based diagnostics. So really trying to kind of capture a wider net as opposed to putting all of our eggs in the basket in those 12 states. In order to expand our ASF surveillance or our national surveillance to include ASF serology, we had to really sit down and think through what a non-negative means and exactly kind of what that communication looks like, what that decision tree looks like, and exactly kind of how we would orient around those results, given that we don't have a carcass to go back to or a premise to go back to. And so we could anticipate that it would look very similar for CSF and for FMD in terms of how we would orient around a non-negative diagnostic. So if a feral swine ELISA comes through the system and it's non-negative, that gets us to our first kind of box around an ASF suspect case. It doesn't meet the case definition for a confirmed case, but obviously would have some major concerns if we haven't had an ELISA non-negative. It would go on immediately for confirmatory testing via aminoperoxidase testing. If it's IPT negative, we're calling that an ASF negative, right? That would be interpreted as a false positive from the ELISA. If it is IPT positive, so it's ELISA positive and IPT positive, we're feeling really, really badly about that. It still doesn't quite meet the case definition for an ASF confirmed case, but we certainly have a suspect given that the diagnostic sensitivity and specificity for the ELISA and the IPT are so good. We would work up a communication around that, and then we would return to that operational site and do a lot of work. We would expand our operational footprint. We would be canvassing for carcasses, and we would be doing extensive surveillance in every animal that was either found dead or removed by our operational services. And again, kind of just a split decision here. If we don't find any non-negative animals, we don't see any evidence of sick and dead feral swine, we don't see any clinical pigs, and everything that is tested is negative, that's an ASF negative. If, however, we find any carcasses on the ground, any clinical feral swine, and any of our sampling comes back non-negative, we move very quickly into an ASF confirmed case and pivot to our ASF Red Book and playbooks that we've developed. So just kind of high level, kind of what we anticipate that to look like if we were ever to approach that. In terms of our ASF response planning, we've been working on this really, really extensively over the last couple of years. I'm sure you all are aware of or familiar with the ASF Red Book, but we know that feral and wildlife, feral swine, feral animals and wildlife pose some really unique challenges from a foreign animal disease outbreak perspective. Determining where controlling the pathogen in these free-ranging species is extremely difficult. We know that, especially in the case of ASF, that kind of spillover, spill-back dynamic is really, really important. And then we often are just lacking some really basic information, like density, like movement data, to really be able to guide and inform our eradication efforts. So in terms of what we would anticipate a control effort to look like, the first big one would be detecting the virus on the landscape. And again, we can anticipate, based on what we've seen in other countries with feral or wild pigs, that lag between the virus introduction and detecting the virus can often be quite long, just because we don't see, wildlife are so stoic. They're really good at kind of masking symptoms and then kind of disappearing off into a hidey hole to die. So that lag can be quite big, and the longer the lag between introduction to detection, the more difficult the control effort becomes. So that window of time is extremely important, and making it as short as possible. Determining the extent of spread is another big one that proves to be quite difficult when you're dealing with free roaming and wild species. Getting those carcasses tested, removed and disposed of in an appropriately biosecure way is also a huge one. We know from our partners in Europe and elsewhere that carcass-based epidemiology is extremely important, and it can be a huge driver of continued spread. And then in our case, just bringing down the susceptible population, so really driving those feral swine populations as low as possible. In terms of our kind of readiness and response planning, we're looking at a 10-kilometer kind of response radius. So, in either picture, we've got either, a single infected animal or an infected sounder or whatever it may be. But we're looking at the first 3 kilometers around that single animal, or, several animals to be what we consider the infection zone. So that's that first 3 kilometers. Then the next 2 kilometers around that are the buffer zone. Those first 5 kilometers, that radius, is our control area. However, for feral swine, well, and then the next 5 kilometers around, the first 5 kilometers is the surveillance area. For feral swine, surveillance is lethal. And so we are basically treating that whole 10 kilometers as a response zone. And we will be removing populations, driving those as low as possible, and then sampling and testing everything. It looks really nice on this cartoon graphic. It looks very clear and straightforward, but of course that's not the reality. And so as we know from high path outbreaks, from VND, from a number of other pathogens, these response and control zones get very big and unwieldy very quickly, and they're quite complicated. And so I just really can't understate the importance of planning and preparedness, and again, trying to have robust surveillance during peacetime to catch that detection event as soon as possible. In terms of our Wildlife Services response planning and goals, the first biggie is going to be identifying feral swine populations within a control zone. And so really figuring out what that looks like and using all available tools to kind of get a handle on that. And so we would want to rely very heavily on our surveillance using camera grids within the area. We wouldn't want a bunch of foot traffic and dogs and people out there. We don't want to disseminate and scatter those populations. And so trying to ascertain as much data as possible in the least invasive way. So helicopter surveillance, drone surveillance, camera grids, all important tools. But again, it's going to be extremely important not to scatter those pigs if we're worried about an ASF outbreak and management. Removing feral swine from the area is going to be extremely important. And again, doing so in a way that is as minimally invasive as possible so we don't scatter pigs. In terms of, we know whole sounder removal is extremely effective and allows for, doesn't allow for the training of animals in terms of getting trap shy and super savvy. In those cases, where we have individual animals or lone boars that are moving alone, wanting to use other appropriate tools to manage those animals. We do rely quite heavily on aerial operations, so the use of helicopters and airplanes for lethal removal in our normal peacetime removal activities. However, whether or not those would be used during an ASF outbreak remains to be seen. Again, really needing to limit the scatter and dispersal of feral swine. In terms of our response goals, kind of continued, conducting ASF virus surveillance is going to be really important. And so, expanding what we're already doing in peacetime using both PCR and serology to kind of get the broadest perspective around kind of where we are in the outbreak in terms of active infection or convalescence. We would continue to rely on our morbidity mortality surveillance tools. And then, of course, the big push, if we were able to eliminate disease, or the perception of eliminate disease, establish that disease freedom. And so wanting to kind of keep that in the back of our mind throughout an outbreak response strategy, that would be the end goal, is to establish disease freedom, and wanting to keep that in perspective throughout the duration of the response. And then, of course, preventing exposure. So we'd want to identify and remove carcasses on the landscape, reduce populations as much as possible to limit the susceptible population. Fencing is a tool that has been used in varying degrees of success around the world, and then work really, really closely with domestic premises in and around the response area to make sure that, to try to eliminate the likelihood for spillover. And so, as I mentioned, Wildlife Services, we do this every day. We've got folks in the field removing pigs every single day. And so just, leveraging the tools that we have in our toolbox to make appropriate decisions, minimize virus spread, minimize pig dispersion, and work as efficiently as possible. And so, we've really kind of bucketed this response into 2 different pots. The first scenario would be where ASF is detected in domestic swine first, whether this be a backyard producer, a slaughter establishment, a commercial facility. It doesn't really matter if it's detected in ASF or if it's detected in domestic swine first, and we don't think it's spilled over yet into feral swine. wanting to prevent that spillover. So kind of a defend the flock, defend the herd, prevent that spillover into feral swine. So that would be kind of our first our major priority would be managing it in domestics and preventing that spillover. If it were detected in domestics first and we didn't think it had spilled over into ferals. Scenario 2 is where ASF is detected in feral swine first, or it spills over quite readily from the domestic population into ferals. And so that's where it becomes a really, really complicated situation quite quickly, not dissimilar to what we've seen in high path from a wild bird to a domestic poultry perspective. And so that would be, our response would be a multi-agency approach. It'd be very comprehensive and it would be quite involved. So that's kind of how we're thinking about what that could look like. And I know I kind of rushed through that, but I'm out of time. And so I'm happy to take any questions in this setting or over email if you all think of something in the coming days. But thanks again for the opportunity. And yeah, I appreciate it.
Excelente, doctora Brown. Muy buena la presentación.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Excellent presentation. Everything was really good. The program that you have in the US for control of this type of wild boars. And now we'll continue with our next member. After Dr. Licona, we'll move on to the Q&A session. So I would like to remind you that we have the chat for you to send your questions. And we will also give you the links for the survey and also for the platform for you to access it. And now I'll introduce Dr. Lecona. He will talk about Mexico's experience in relation to the handling and surveillance on feral swine in Mexico. Dr. Lecona Olivares is a zootechnist veterinarian from La UNAM with a specialty on epidemiology at the Secretariat of Health and especially on a high management of public institutions at the Public Institute of Public Administration, and also control and prevention of wildlife diseases from USDA AFS. Since March 2004, he has been an agricultural specialist in the animal health of the Department of Agriculture of the United States in Mexico, in charge of the binational cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico for monitoring, prevention, and control of feral swine diseases with an impact on public health and animal health, both wild and domestic. In addition, he cooperates as a member of the scientific committee for rabies in the Americas. So the floor is yours.
Gracias, buenos días. No sé si ven mi presentación.
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder if you can see my presentation clearly. Yes, we can. And first, I would like to thank AICA for the possibility to participate in this event. And I would like to also take this moment to offer an apology to everyone, because unfortunately, today I had two very important meetings and we were summoned, and I had to be part in one, part in another at the same time. We have also an Ibero-American swine association, so I'm a little too many things in my hand. And the second reason I want to apologize is because I considered timely for this presentation to be in English, and I'll speak in Spanish just to make it a little more easy. And the third apology is because unfortunately I won't tell you what Mexico is doing, because it's not the scope of an officer of the Department of Agriculture of the U.S. For Mexico. What I can share, and I'll focus in giving you a landscape of how we have collaborated with Mexico in terms of feral swine and what's been the relation that has brought us to this point of collaboration. So if you allow me, I will focus on this, and I believe it will be very timely that later on to find participation of Mexican officials who would be the most proper to speak about specific actions on surveillance in Mexico and to have an idea of what they do in a regular basis. Without further ado, I'll start with this presentation and say that feral swine affairs in Mexico have been around for a long time. We're about to turn 10 years of negotiations, collaboration on feral swine negotiations that started in 2015, where we established the need to establish collaboration uh, for feral swine between Mexico and the US. So the first thing that was done between 2015 and 2017 was to develop a number of workshops for management, control, and surveillance for feral swine. And all these years, there were 7 workshops in various places. There was 2 workshops in UNAM. There was one in Coahuila, Nuevo León, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, and uh, Sonora, Mexico. All these focus on trying to share the experiences with Mexican officials on what is the risk, what is the capacity of destroying feral swine, and how we manage this in the US as a routine business. In this regard, we use the workshops to train staff on sample taking techniques, uh, mapping of feral swine, and also aspects related to biosecurity and epidemiological surveillance of this species. We have also participated in an important number of meetings and events, academic as well as Bonanza, and with the as well as the different associations of veterinarian physicians related to feral uh, life, or and we have been participating wherever we've been summoned. With this slide, I want to show you the links, the relations and efforts made with various organizations, with various groups, with central, national, state offices, and how the collaboration has modified in this regard. I do want to start by presenting the maps we received from the different colleagues of the regions to show us what is the impact and the presence of feral swine in the various regions. As you can see, each map has a source, an area that is reporting this condition, how these maps have modified to read the Conavio map, which establishes in 2016 an update to 2020 with a reference, a georeference of feral swine in Mexico. Although you can see there's areas with higher density of population, you can see that pretty much in all national Mexican territory has presence of feral swine at this moment. So based on this criteria, is that we collaborated with them with different mechanisms. This is the first mechanism. This is the memorandum of understanding signed between the Universidad Nacional Autónoma Mexico, which is the first institution we're able to work with, and we signed this memorandum. And due to this agreement, there were other programs that were signed, like this one, which is the workshop for feral swine for Coahuila, and is still enacted in Coahuila, is still in operation. We also generated this interinstitutional regulation for the state of Chihuahua for the control of feral swine. And based on all these documents, UNAVE issued a manual on sampling and sending of samples for feral swine. And based on that, with a national TGVS seminar, we created, there was a first plan created for the attention of feral swine. We, from our behalf, and this complements what was already submitted or what was already presented a moment ago, the Department of Agriculture of the U.S. through the National Feral Swine Program, a bit explained by Virna just a moment ago, has created a number of materials that, although these are for the dissemination within the U.S., we still have a material available in Spanish that has been used in the U.S. as well as shared with Mexico. In the USDA website, you'll find this section dedicated to feral swine in Spanish with leaflets on technical information, useful technical information. Possibly the most important document of all this is a leaflet on feral swine diseases, which is a reference to the most important diseases and the mechanisms to monitor and for sample taking. And all this, of course, is reflected in the procedure and the surveillance procedures manual of the African swine fever, which is one of the documents Vienna referred to. And we have a version in Spanish that is also available by request. But there's been many other areas of work, unfortunately, because of the loss of Roberto Navarro. We had a gap, but before this happened, we collaborated with the Mexican support of Dr. Armando Mateos from the US side, very known by all of you, Peter Fernandez, and there was a number of workshops established that initially were held virtually online, and unfortunately, we have not been able to take these to practice from the operational standpoint. But since 2021, we did start working on all of this to define risk diseases on swine. And then in 2022 was very specific based on reports, cases in the Dominican Republic, where started getting closer to this effort to define specific collaboration activities where uh, we participate directly together with the staff of agriculture department in Mexico. And this is the model of the workshop that was to be held in field that we have not achieved, but we continue working on this to try to continue strengthening the training mechanisms. Additional to this, from wildlife, the Department of Agriculture has collaborated directly with Sermarat, with the integration of a feral swine control group in North America, with the participation of officers of wildlife, but also of agriculture of Canada, of the US, and Mexico. And this has given us the opportunity to participate in a number of international conferences where we have sought the participation of Mexico in risk of forums, but also we have directly intervened in the Trilateral Committee for Wildlife and Conservation, where we have also presented the achievements and success of what has been done in North America. And this is the presentation of David Kelman, the wildlife director of the state of Arizona, who is the coordinator for this group, where they spoke about two important issues for feral swine, rabies and feral swine. And as you can see in this picture, it's from Campeche, Mexico. And here you can see a bat, Hematophagous, feeding off of a feral swine. This is the first meeting, an oral meeting where we participated. And here you can see participation for people from Canada, from the US, and Mexico. And from this standpoint, the National Commission for Protected Areas acknowledges different areas where the presence of feral swine represents a greater risk and is there where there's been a special focus. Lately, they're dedicating efforts to Mochililla in Durango. And to summarize all of these activities regionally, there's been a greater need to participate in a trilateral group, Canada, US, and Mexico, to manage and control feral swine. We're pursuing technical and financial cooperation for specific plans on feral swine control. Also, we're pursuing management and control uh, workshops in collaboration regarding high vulnerability in various areas and the exchange of information to have significant advances in this regard. So, what perspective does Mexico bring at this moment? Well, to continue collaboration work and implement specific collaboration activities for assistance and monitoring management surveillance of feral swine diseases. All this has been translated directly to the impact of African swine fever, which has given us the opportunity to count with Dr. Sylvia Kreindel from Mexico, who participated in a number of events since 2023 and now in 2024 as the head of the command of African swine fever in Dominican Republic. And her participation has given us the opportunity to have a closer approach with Mexico. And based on this, we achieved that just at the end of August, September of this year, a Mexican delegation of the Secretariat of Agriculture of CPA to be able to attend and go to Dominican Republic to give special trainings on the management of cross-border diseases. And although at this moment the African swine fever is not a cross-border disease in the Dominican Republic, it is important to strengthen the knowledge for Dominican Republic officials and Haiti, as well as for other countries in the Caribbean, and because of the potential arrival of the disease to the continental zone. In this regard, participation of international organizations such as AICA, such as OIRSA, such as FAO, have a fundamental role in negotiations because it's not always easy to keep officers with or officials with officials. I just want to end this reflecting on the importance of maintaining a relation, knowledge, collaboration, and to advance jointly to have the possibility of having tangible results very soon without further uh, without further issues. Any comments or questions? Thank you very much, Dr. Leguana. Excellent. All the information you provided. And now we'll have the Q&A panel. So I invite all panel members, Dr. Audrey, as well as Dr. Masilius, as well as Dr. Brown. So I encourage you to join us in the Q&A session. We already have several questions in our chat. So we'll start with Dr. Capusano. We'll begin. Well, this first question is for Dr. Stanley, for Andre. And the question is, what recommendations on biosecurity do you suggest for smallholders or small producers of swine where there are also feral swine? Biosecurity recommendations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is, of course, very difficult to have a recipe for for each and every situation, but there is generic guidance which developed by FAO, which has a biocontainment and bioexclusion part. And FAO developed progressive management pathway for biosecurity, where we assess situation with the current practices and try to pilot biosecurity measures which require less financial investments, as we call it on our jargon, low-hanging fruit. And usually it started with fencing, with some limited access of visitors to farm. Also issues related to swill feeding, because swill feeding one of the most important risk factors for introduction of African swine fever to backyard. And of course, as already colleague mentioned, hunters need to pay attention when they do hunting and when they have backyard pigs at home, because that's another very high risk operation. When you bring infected carcass of wild boar to the backyard farm, basically, I can refer to the FAO publication on biosecurity in pork sector, and also our studies, our pilot studies, and recommendations stemming out from these studies related to progressive management pathway for transboundary animal diseases, with some of examples on how improve biosecurity in one of country.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Rosalny.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosalny. Excellent with this. Dr. Campos for the next question. Thank you, Andre. And the next question is also for you. What do you recommend for American countries that have feral swine on how to approach the elimination of those populations of feral swine?
I'm sorry, Rosa, could you please repeat the question?
Yes. ¿Qué recomienda?
What do you recommend to American countries that have feral swine population on how to approach the elimination of these populations of feral swine, to eliminate the populations?
Well, that's a very challenging question in terms of feasibility, because it was many attempts to eradicate or eliminate, which all failed, unless you are on a small island. So I would recommend to basically do surveillance and to detect your risk mapping using geographical information system and do enhanced surveillance, and also cooperate with hunters and biologists, zoologists for these purposes, for early detection, but also in case of suspected cases to bring them on board for the measures which described in the presentations, for control, for biosecurity measures, but the elimination in most of cases is not realistic.
Gracias, Andre.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. And the following question is for Dr. Marius. Dr. Marius, we're being asked here, what proportion or percentage of cases of African swine fever do you consider is caused by animal movement? What percentage of that?
Yes, thank you very much. Very good question. And it's very difficult to estimate how many of the cases are linked directly with the direct movement of the wild boars. For example, every year in each of the infected countries, so there are thousands of the wild boars which are found dead or are hunted and being tested and detected as positive for African swine fever. So we are mainly focusing on the infected areas, trying to follow the evolution of the disease by detecting the new cases or by following the epidemiological situation, detecting the secondary cases. Which one of them is directly linked with the human activity, or which one is directly linked with the movement of the wild boar is it is impossible to estimate. So we are mainly looking at the cases, and we are trying to perform the in-depth analysis in the continuity of the evolution of the disease. So if the cases are located in the distance of the home range of the wild boar, you can still consider that this is the natural transmission through the movement of the infected animals. But even after the careful analysis, if we see so that there are some small to medium jumps, which is over the natural home range of the wild boar, where link them to the human activities. That the percentage actually, I would say it might be over 90% of all the cases should be linked with the natural movement of the infected animals, and less than 10% we might link to the human activities. But again, this is not the golden standard. So it's vary from country to country and again from area to area.
Perfecto. También para el doctor Maciel.
Perfect. Thank you also for Dr. Marios Masilius. What measures have been implemented to, sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Sí, ¿qué medidas se
Yes,
han
what measures have been implemented to control the trade of these animals?
The trade, you mean the wild boars alive or the meat of the wild boars?
No, en general para los
Well, in general, the trade of the animals, it could be a trade of animals. It could also be related to the illegal mobilization of the swine in general.
Yes, of course it might happen because the African swine fever again might be spread through the human activities, through the mechanical transmission via infected meat or meat products, via live animals, and especially via illegal trade or movement. Because legally, if the animals are moved within the infected country, of course they are supervised by the official veterinarian, so they are clinically inspected. If necessary, they are sampled, and only then, so they are certified as being healthy. But so this illegal movement or smuggling, it might again occur, but again, it's not very common. Looking broadly at the European continent as general one. So it happened that from the infected areas, so the animals might be moved illegally to still non-infected animals, to the still non-infected areas, and then the outbreak is detected. But this is possible again to trace back through the epidemiological investigation and through the traceability tools available in Europe, because all the pigs should be identified. All their movement should be documented. If it becomes to the illegal case, so that is clearly again stated by the countries that non-identified animals through the illegal movement has been introduced and the disease has been detected in such a way. So all this information again is publicly available, and the countries try to present the epidemiological situation in a very transparent way, without hiding even such a very sensitive issues such as illegal activities of the humans.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Marius.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marius. And another question also to you, Dr. Marius, is how have you managed, and which has been the answer you have obtained from all these hunting groups, hunters groups in your country? How have you managed that?
So again, very good question. It's really differs from country to country, but more or less the principles remain the same. All the hunting activities are very strictly regulated by the country. For example, I will take my country as an example. On the territory of 64,000 square kilometers, we have over 900 hunting clubs. So that's the groups of the hunters who manage appropriate hunting grounds. So the hunting rules are set up by the government of my country. All the hunting rules are strictly supervised by the governmental institutions such as environmental supervision centers. So we have the environmental inspectors, which has the power legally to check the hunters. Do they have the license? Do they hunt in the appropriate time frame during the hunting season? What type of animals they hunt? And if they have submitted the samples from the hunted wild boars for African swine fever testing. So all the hunting activities are very strictly regulated. However, sometimes the control mechanisms might be not sufficient to check each and every hunter. In my country, we have over 30,000 of the hunters. So you cannot be, you can control each and every of them. However, through the strict legislative tools, again, we have the power to penalize or impose some administrative sanctions, including remove the license for the hunt or just forbid the hunt in general for some of the hunting groups. So with such a different tools, we're still able really to control the hunting activity, and the hunters has the responsibility to provide the regular reports to the Ministry of Environment, how many animals have been hunted, in which time frame, during which season, etc. So there are actually the very good cooperation and collaboration between the governmental institution and very well structured the activities of the hunting grounds and hunting clubs. So this is really help us to follow all the process and to control the hunting activity, and as well to pose the control over the wild boar management.
Muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta es
Thank you
para
very much. The next question is for Andre. And for any of the speakers, if you want to elaborate on it. The question is, should surveillance of feral pigs or wild boars be part of the surveillance of domestic pigs, or should it be separate? And what are your recommendations for the handling of animals?
Yeah,
The last part of your questions, you were cut mid-sentence. For the handling of animals, and yeah, the last question was, what are the recommendations that you have to handle animals in relation to sampling? I mean, wild animals. Thank you.
I think Dr. Marius already presented very widely this, but I think it's crucial for both for surveillance, but also for biosecurity to follow correct procedures, because that might be one of the way of introduction of virus actually, in both ways, from backyard pigs to wildlife to feral pigs, and from feral pigs to the domestic backyard domestic pigs. So that's quite important to keep in mind for any field veterinarians who do the surveillance.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien que quisiera aportar? Doctor Marius, por favor.
Thank you. Any contributions? Dr. Marius, go ahead.
So if I may jump in to this discussion, of course, the countries following different approach for the surveillance. And if I understood correctly your question, you are referring mostly to the active surveillance, when the principle is to sample the healthy-looking animal. So actually, we have changed completely the surveillance strategy from active to passive, because sampling the healthy animals, so handling with them, you need a lot of, again, human resources, equipment, biosecurity principles. So following the passive surveillance approach, if the samples are taken from the dead animals in the backyards, from dead pig, in the large commercial pig holdings, from the last 2 or 5 or 10 dead animals on the weekly basis, it would provide much more valuable information about the situation of African swine fever in the particular pig keeping place, including hunting ground, instead to focus on the healthy animals, better to focus on the dead ones. So the number of the samples would be much lower, but the accuracy and the probability of detection of the disease would become much, much higher. So in Europe, we started to change from active to passive surveillance, more and more collecting samples from the dead animals rather than from the healthy looking ones, by collecting the blood, by testing it by serology, etc. For example, for the wild boars, we completely we do not collect any single sample for serology using ELISA testing method, because antibodies having such a situation as we have, so being an endemic country, antibodies do not show anything. So we are focusing on the samples which would be tested by PCR. So we are focusing for the virus detection, but not for serological investigation anymore. So that approach, again, would be very helpful. And as Andre already mentioned, by passive surveillance, the probability is much higher to detect the first cases rather than by active surveillance, by collecting blood from the healthy animals. So that's, again, this philosophy, it came with the years working with African swine fever.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Marius.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marius. To continue along this same line, we have another question for you, Dr. Marius, from Orlando, asking what genotypes do you usually find in the cases of PPA in your country?
So I think so since 2007, when African swine fever virus has been introduced in Germany and started in Georgia and started to spread, we are talking only about the genotype 2. All the countries in Europe, as well in Asia and now in Caribbean, so we are dealing with the same genotype 2. So in Sardinia, they had genotype 1 since 1982, but just 2 months ago, finally, the Sardinia has reported and officially declared as being free. So in Europe, we do not have the genotype 1 anymore, just the genotype 2.
De acuerdo. Otra pregunta para el doctor.
Thank you. Another question for Dr. Marius. Can you describe the biosafety measures applied when using dogs in order to locate the feral pigs out in the woods, considering that these dogs would be in contact with these pigs that died out of a PPA?
Okay, thank you. That's again a very interesting and very good question. Different countries, so they're using different tools on how to minimize the risk of introduction or a spread of the virus via different tools, trucks, people, and as well dogs. So this is one of the examples that the minimum biosecurity rules should be followed all the time. So those dogs who are trained for the search of the carcass, so they are working only in the limited infected area. They are entering through the entering point and they are leaving after the careful biosecurity procedures has been followed. What does it mean? The dogs are being washed, So we do not use the disinfectant on them because they are not being in the direct contact with the domestic pigs or wild boars, but they are being washed. And at least for the period set by the member countries, usually it is from 48 to 72 hours. So they are not moving to other areas instead of being only in the infected one. So in this presentation, we see some of the examples of the cleaning and disinfection activities of the trucks or cars which has been used in the infected area. Again, so that's nothing super special, but you need to follow these procedures. You need to carefully wash it, clean and disinfect. The dogs are being washed in the specially designated places only with the water, and actually that's it. If those procedures would not be followed, if the dogs would be freely moved from one place to the other one, of course, the risk and the probability that the virus would be transmitted via mechanical way would be much, much higher. So we are always trying to minimize the risk and to lower the virus contamination of the environment. So that's the key point.
Perfecto. Tenemos otra para usted, doctor Marius.
Perfect. Another question for you, Dr. Marius. Luis Antonio Gomez from Mexico asked, do you monitor other pig diseases on those that are found dead, like tuberculosis, for example?
In my country, we are looking for African swine fever, and because we have it already for 10 years. But in case there are some negative results, which might happen because the animals are dying not only because of African swine fever, but due to their age, due to the bullets, or due to the other diseases, we are looking for classical swine fever as well. But it's up to the country to decide. Our main focus, because we are already endemic country, we are focusing to African swine fever, and that's it. Previous programs has been conducted by testing as well for Orzeczki or classical swine fever. That's it. We do not monitor the other diseases which might cause the death of the wild boar. But if the samples are taken, so from those samples, so there are a variety of the diseases which might be tested in the national laboratory without any problem.
Perfecto. Tenemos ahora una para la doctora
Perfect.
Brown.
We now have a question for Dr. Brown from Hugo Lopez. How much do you know about the incidence of a production, non-technified production of backyard pigs for the transmission of these and other diseases in Latin America?
Sorry, just to clarify, the question is around production disease. What do I know about production diseases in Latin America?
Sí, pero yo creo que podría usted enfocarlo un poco.
But maybe you could focus more on the United States, because the question talks about the transmission of these and other diseases in Latin America, but I guess they meant the United States based on your work.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I feel like I'm still a little bit unclear. The question is around production diseases at the feral swine, domestic swine interface in the US, because we don't have ASF, of course.
Sí, si gusta pasamos a la siguiente, porque la pregunta es...
We'll move on to the next questions regarding the incidence of backyard pigs in the transmission of these and other diseases. but I guess it should be limited to the island where it is down because you don't have it in the US. So we'll move on to the next question, which is also addressed to you from Dr. Gomez Mendieta. How are you handling in the United States the disposal of carcasses of wild pigs? Feral pigs that you've found either ill or dead.
Yeah, great question. So we are, if they are found dead or sick, we are using a number of different methods of disposal. So often we partner with a local veterinary school to either incinerate the carcass out or with a landfill to do a deep burial. Wild pigs that are removed just as healthy pigs that are removed just part of normal operational activities, those are actually left on the landscape.
Muchas gracias, doctora Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. We have another question for you, and it says, what would happen if you found a wild pig that is confirmed in terms of the wild population and family farms around the region? It's just a possible hypothetical scenario.
Yeah, great question. So depending on the proximity of that farm, we would be working in super close partnership with the state animal health official and veterinary services, and exactly what the disposition of that premise would be based on local epi. Do we think that is there evidence that the domestic swine are interfacing with the feral swine in that area? At the very least, that premise would be subjected to quarantine, to testing and monitoring. Depending on the likelihood of suspicion around interactions, they could be depopulated, but it would be really handled on a case-by-case basis. But we could certainly anticipate permitted movements, and a lot of kind of testing and monitoring around that premise.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias.
Perfect, thank you. And we have another question for you, Dr. Brown. Do you currently use in the US a hunting in order to control the population of wild pigs?
Another great question. We do have local hunters, like private hunters, that take a number of feral swine each year. We do not, however, contract with private hunters as a part of population reduction techniques. And that is that, although hunters take a lot of pigs, they are also one of the primary reasons for the anthropogenic movement and the spread of feral swine. And also that, there's often what is most important for population reduction, and what hunters are interested in terms of like a trophy animal are often different populations. So we do have a lot of recreational hunting within the US for feral swine, but we do not rely on private hunters as a part of our population reduction methods.
Muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta también.
Thank you very much. The next question is for you too, Dr. Brown, from Dr. Rosalba Carrion. What is the size of the sample that you are considering in the United States for surveillance of PPA?
Another great question. We are sampling, as part of national surveillance, we're sampling over 6,000 animals each year. And then we've taken an additional 6,000 to 7,000 each year as a part of our kind of expanded ASF and CSF surveillance. We had originally expanded, so from 2014 through 2021, we had our sample size at around 2,800 animals. And then in 2021, we expanded that sample size to be in line with WOA surveillance standards.
Doctora Brown, si puede repetir su respuesta porque la intérprete tuvo un problema para escuchar su audio.
Oh yeah, sure. So In 2021, we expanded our sample size from 2,800 to 6,000, such that it was in line with the 1% detection for
Perdón.
WOA.
Perdón,
Yep.
doctora Brown, qué pena. ¿No se está traduciendo al español, por favor?
Do you want me to repeat? Or I can write it?
Ya, ahora sí, por favor.
Okay.
Ok, adelante.
Okay. We expanded our surveillance from 2,800 as the sample size to 6,000, which is in line with a 1% detection rate for ASF and CSF as part of the WOA guidelines. So we hit a minimum of 6,000 samples each year, but we've been doing substantially more than that since the detection in the Caribbean.
Muchísimas gracias. Y la última pregunta es para el doctor.
Thank you very much. And the last question for Dr. Lecona. To start with the closing, Dr. Lecona, where can we find all these materials that have been developed by the USDA with Mexico, and are they available in English and or Spanish? Thank you. Very kind for your question. As I mentioned during my presentation, on the webpage of the USDA, I am trying to find the link to share it with you. That's where you can find a section in Spanish dedicated to feral pigs, where you can find all the information that I showed you, everything that's available in Spanish on that page. Thank you very much. So if you can, please share the link with us in the chat so that anyone can access it. That would be great. I would like to thank all the panel members for all the presentations and for the excellent questions received. In the interest of time, we'll close the Q&A session, not without giving the floor to Katia with a summary, and then we'll have some announcements. So, Katia, go ahead, please. It's been a pleasure sharing with all the panel members that we had today. First, to start with the ladies. Well, you're with us even though you're so far away, so it's late for you. So we would like to really appreciate your participation and the important presentations that you made today based on the experience that you have to share with the Latin American countries. All the presentations have been really relevant and interesting, particularly because we know that there are some topics that some countries are not very experienced with. So we would like to have more details, more information. Some countries have made more progress. And also the experience that all of you have shared as part of this webinar implies the actions that we can start with, particularly when it comes to public and private associations and cooperation for the interested sectors regarding the strategies to be applied. And also we want to make available to each of to all experts to see how you are going to link the working systems for surveillance at country level, be it for sampling and for the surveillance methods and the whole component regarding how we can structure and design all of this, which is not going to be useful not only for this information, but also for many others. And one of the tools, which are the satellite systems, for the analysis of data of the populations existing in your countries that need to be well structured, particularly when it comes to begin, because I think that one of the things that you mentioned was the importance to have a national updated census of the different species that you might have identified in your countries that might represent or pose a risk, which applies not only for ASF, but also for the different species that represent a risk and all the diseases that have been detected. And that's why it is really relevant for you to be able to take into account that these seminars, even though they are addressed to ASF. They can be strictly related to the surveillance methods that you have designed for each of your countries, and all of these initial responses or all the questions that were identified by the participants and posed to the speakers that have already been answered. I know that they are all important, and if another question comes up, maybe we can address them. And if you require assistance, we are here. Thank you, Erika. Thank you for moderating the Q&A session and the event. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you very much, Katia. And before closing, I would just like to remind you to complete the survey. It's important for all the international organizations that work on this effort to bring to you all these trainings and webinars. And for us, it's really important to have a response regarding the impact that these webinars represent when it comes to surveillance and all the official services, the academia, the private sector, and all of you that are regularly participating in our webinars. You can also click on the link that we have for a platform where we have all the webinars to be able to share all this information to your countries. And also Dr. Lecuona has already shared his link for all the materials in the chat. So now you can access all this important information that have been developed regarding this topic. And I would like to say that next year, we'll continue with this initiative of webinars. Our next webinar of the year will take place in February. And please be on the lookout for all our regular invitations. Again, I would like to thank the speakers, Marius, Andri, Vienna, and Dr. Lecuona for their excellent contributions. And it's been an honor to have you with us again, because this is not the first time. So we rely on your cooperation to keep on developing all these topics based on your experience. I would like to thank Rocio for all the help. She is essential to our team for the development of all these webinars, Katia, and all the people that we have behind scenes. I would like to thank you all for participating. Happy holidays. And enjoy your vacation. Rocio, I don't know if you want to say something. That's it for me. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all the participants. And it's great to see messages from Marius and Andre in Spanish. I would also like to thank the support of our colleagues on IT and the interpreters that are always supporting us with their best efforts. So happy holidays to you all. Hope you can rest and see you in February. Please do not miss out on this. See you soon.
Hay alguien que menciona, creo que tuvieron algo de problemas en la entrada de las encuestas.
Sí, pero ya se solucionó.
Bueno, ahí hubo uno que al final dijo que no pudo entrar. No, déjame ver quién fue. Juan Antonio Montaño.
También se las vamos a estar